What happens when you take millions of angry men, men who've seen their homes destroyed, their families killed, and their country invaded, and you send them into the land of the enemy? In 1945, the Soviet army entered Germany. They came not just with tanks and guns, but with years of rage, pain, and a thirst for revenge. What followed was not just a victory. It was a storm of destruction, violence, and one of the most brutal occupations in modern history. This isn't a story from just one side. It's not about blaming or excusing anyone. It's about understanding the real cost of war, not just on the battlefield, but in people's lives. What happened when the Red Army crossed into Germany is rarely spoken about in full. In this video, we're going to talk about it all, what led to the violence, how deep it went, and why it matters today. So stay with me. This is history that challenges how we think about war, justice, and humanity. Part 1. Why the Red Army wanted revenge. To understand what happened in Germany in 1945, we need to go back to 1941. That's when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in what was called Operation Barbarossa. It wasn't just a military attack. It was meant to wipe out Soviet power and people. The Nazis believed they were superior. They saw Slavic people, like Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, as less than human. So when they marched into the Soviet Union, they didn't just fight soldiers. They burned villages, hanged civilians, starved cities, and left behind total ruin. Over the next 4 years, the Soviet people suffered more than most could imagine. Whole towns disappeared. Families were executed just for being Jewish or for helping the Red Army. Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, was surrounded and starved for almost 900 days. People ate anything they could: dogs, wallpaper paste, even each other. By the time the war was nearing its end, around 27 million Soviet citizens had died. That's more than the populations of entire countries. Many were civilians, women, children, the elderly. So when Soviet soldiers began to push the Germans back in 1943 and 1944, they weren't just fighting to win. They were filled with hate. Many had lost their brothers, parents, wives. They wanted payback. And that payback came hard. Part 2. The first shock, Nemmersdorf. In October 1944, the Red Army entered Nemmersdorf, a small town in East Prussia. It was one of the first German towns to fall to Soviet forces. What happened there sent shockwaves through Germany. When German forces later retook the town, they claimed to have found civilians, men, women, children, killed brutally. Some were shot while trying to flee. Some, it was said, had been raped and beaten. There were stories of bodies hanging from barns and people crushed by tanks. Nazi propaganda quickly picked this up. Posters and films showed the horrors of Nemmersdorf, warning the German people. This is what the Russians will do to you. Now, some of those claims were exaggerated or even staged by the Nazis, but many were real. Independent investigators later confirmed that civilians had been murdered. And the worst part was, it wasn't just Nemmersdorf. It was only the beginning. Part 3. A wave of violence. As the Red Army pushed into East Germany in early 1945, village after village, town after town saw the same thing: destruction, looting, and mass rape. Estimates say that around 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers. It's a staggering number. It happened in cities, small towns, even in hospitals and churches. Girls as young as 8 and women as old as 80 were attacked. No one was truly safe. Women were raped in front of their families. Some were raped repeatedly. Some were gang raped by groups of soldiers. Others were raped and then killed. Some killed themselves to avoid what was coming. In some places, women cut their own hair short and smeared themselves with dirt to appear older or sick. Anything to not be noticed, but it often didn't work. One woman in Berlin wrote in her diary, "It's not a question of 1 man or 10. It's hundreds. They're like animals." And here's the thing. It wasn't just revenge. Some soldiers did it because they felt powerful. Some saw German women as a reward. And yes, Soviet commanders often looked the other way. They gave speeches about discipline, but on the ground, the chaos was too much. Few were punished. Even Soviet women who were soldiers in the Red Army said they feared their own men. Some were raped by fellow soldiers. The violence didn't stop with the enemy. Part 4. looting and destruction. The Red Army also looted homes, shops, and even museums. Soviet soldiers took watches, rings, food, beds, curtains, anything that looked valuable. Entire trainloads of goods were sent back to the Soviet Union. These weren't just personal items. Machines, tools, even whole factory equipment were packed up and shipped east. The Soviets called it reparations, payback for what Germany had done to them. But often it wasn't official. Soldiers just broke into homes and took what they wanted. Some Germans returned to their houses to find nothing left. No furniture, no clothes, not even floorboards. Farms were burned. Livestock was taken or killed. Schools and libraries were turned into barracks or ruined completely. A lot of Soviet soldiers had grown up poor. They had never seen homes like the ones in Germany, full of food, running water, and modern appliances. To them, it felt unfair. Why should their enemy live better than they ever had? So they took everything, and they left little behind. Part 5, Berlin, the Final Battle. In April 1945, the Red Army reached Berlin. This was the heart of Hitler's empire. But by then, the city was already falling apart. German men were either dead at war or hiding. Many civilians were elderly, women, and children. The city had been bombed for years. Now it was surrounded. The battle for Berlin was fierce. Soviet tanks rolled through the streets. Every building became a battleground. Civilians hid in cellars, subway tunnels, and basements. And once the city surrendered in May, the violence exploded again. Around 100,000 women were raped in Berlin. Hospitals overflowed with victims. Some women needed surgery after being assaulted by dozens of men. Many got pregnant. Many got sick. Some disappeared altogether. One German midwife said she delivered hundreds of babies whose fathers were unknown Soviet soldiers. Many of those babies were abandoned. This was not an accident of war. It was a storm of revenge, power, and lawlessness. Part 6. Why did this happen? Some people ask, were these men just monsters? But the truth is more complicated. These were men who had lived through one of the bloodiest wars in history. Many had seen their villages burned by Germans. Some had watched their families killed. They had lived with hunger, pain, and fear for years. They were told every day by Soviet propaganda, the Germans are your enemy. They deserve nothing. Take everything. Teach them a lesson. And Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, made it worse. When asked about the rapes, he brushed it off. He said, "What is so awful in having fun with a woman after such horrors?" That kind of thinking gave permission for the violence to continue. Not all Soviet soldiers acted this way. Some were kind. Some protected civilians. But they were often too few to stop the wave of rage. Part 7. Aftermath and Silence. After the war, the Soviets controlled East Germany. They built a wall. They spread communist rule. But they never admitted what happened in 1945. In Soviet books and speeches, the Red Army were heroes, liberators. There was no mention of the rapes or the looting. Talking about it was dangerous. For decades, victims stayed silent. German women who had been raped often hid it. Some were ashamed. Some feared judgment. Some just wanted to forget. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that historians started digging deeper. Survivors spoke out. Diaries were found. Documents were released. And finally, the world began to hear the truth. This part of history is hard to accept, but we must. Part 8. Before the war, Germany and the Soviet Union. Before Germany and the Soviet Union became enemies, they were actually partners for a short time. In 1939, just before World War II began, they signed a secret deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement said they wouldn't attack each other, but it also divided parts of Europe between them. They both invaded Poland, Germany from the west, the Soviets from the east. For almost 2 years, the two sides stayed out of each other's way. But it didn't last. In June 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched the biggest surprise attack in military history, Operation Barbarossa. The Germans attacked across a 2,900-kilometer front, catching the Soviet Union off guard. In the first few months, the Red Army suffered huge losses. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Millions of soldiers were captured. Many were sent to POW camps, where most would die from cold, hunger, or disease. From the very start, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union was brutal. It was a war of survival, filled with cruelty on both sides. So when the Soviets finally started pushing the Germans back in 1943 and 1944, they remembered everything. They weren't just fighting for their country. They were fueled by revenge. Part 9, Propaganda, Feeding the Fire. Soviet leaders knew the anger their people felt, and they used it. Propaganda played a big role in shaping how Soviet soldiers saw Germans, not just the Nazis, but all Germans. Newspapers printed stories of Nazi crimes, mass shootings, destroyed villages, children burned alive. Soviet radio told soldiers to crush the enemy. Posters showed the Red Army marching into Germany with slogans like, "Take revenge." One Soviet newspaper article said, "Kill the German. Your mother is waiting. Your country is waiting. Don't stop. Kill." Poems, songs, speeches, all push the same message. Germans were not people. They were enemies to be punished. This made it easier for soldiers to do things they wouldn't normally do. When you no longer see your enemy as human, you stop caring how they suffer. And for soldiers who had already lost everything, this message was powerful. Some Soviet officers tried to keep discipline. But the truth is, many commanders looked the other way. Some even encouraged the violence quietly, believing it would raise morale or push fear into the German people. Part 10, Other Cities, Same Stories. Berlin wasn't the only city to suffer. All across East Germany, the same horrors repeated again and again. In Königsberg, today called Kaliningrad, the Red Army stormed the city in April 1945. The German defenders fought hard, but they were overwhelmed. When the Soviets entered, they looted homes and raped women just like in other towns. One survivor later said, "The Russians came into our cellar. They laughed and joked. Then they took my mother and my sister. I never saw them again." In Dresden, which had already been bombed by the British and Americans in one of the most devastating air raids of the war, Soviet troops arrived to find a city in ruins. But still, they looted what was left and raped many of the surviving women. In towns like Frankfurt, Oder, Leipzig, and Potsdam, German civilians told of similar horrors. People dragged from basements, women attacked in churches, families begging for mercy and getting none. Even refugees weren't spared. Columns of Germans fleeing westward, many of them women, children, and the elderly, were often caught by Soviet patrols. Instead of safety, they found more violence. One young girl who survived the flight from Silesia later wrote, "We were told to walk and not stop, but at night they came. The soldiers, they pulled women from the wagons. My aunt was taken. She never came back." Part 11, Inside the Red Army. It's important to understand the Red Army itself. Many of the Soviet soldiers were very young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Some had grown up during the brutal 1930s, when Stalin's purges and forced famines devastated the Soviet countryside. These men had little education, little comfort, and had known violence for most of their lives. By 1945, they had marched thousands of kilometers. They had seen friends die in front of them. They had slept in snow, fought in forests, and eaten moldy bread. Many were deeply traumatized. When they entered Germany, they found a land that looked untouched. Towns still had buildings. Stores had food. Homes had clean water and radios. To many Soviet soldiers, it looked like paradise compared to what they'd lived through. And some thought, why should they live like this when my home was burned to the ground? This mix of envy, rage, and pain turned deadly. Soviet command issued orders. Don't loot, don't touch civilians. But these orders were not always followed. Some commanders didn't even bother to enforce them. There was also alcohol, lots of it. Many German families had stored wine, beer, and brandy. Soviet soldiers found it and drank heavily. Drunkenness made the violence worse. Some soldiers said later, "We didn't feel like humans anymore. We felt like ghosts, like shadows moving through hell." Part 12, The Women's Side. The women in Germany bore the worst of this violence. Some were mothers with babies. Some were teenagers. Others were grandmothers. Many were raped over and over again. Some were forced to cook and clean for the soldiers who raped them. A few women tried to protect themselves by offering themselves to one soldier, hoping he would protect them from the rest. These arrangements sometimes helped, but often they didn't. Doctors in Berlin wrote that they treated thousands of women for injuries caused by rape. Some women were raped with weapons or broken bottles. Many were infected with diseases. Some bled to death. Pregnancy became a common result. In hospitals, nurses described whole wards filled with women trying to recover from assault, physically and mentally. Many of these women kept silent for decades. In post-war Germany, talking about rape was taboo. Some women were blamed. Others were ignored. Only much later did their stories come out. Part 13, Children of Violence. There's a group of people history often forgets. The children born from these rapes. In Germany, they were often called Russian children. Some were raised by their mothers. Others were sent to orphanages. Many never knew who their fathers were. These children grew up in a country that didn't want to talk about them. Some were bullied in school. Some were told lies about where they came from. As adults, many searched for answers, who their fathers were, what happened to their mothers, and how to understand the past they inherited. A few even traveled to Russia in search of family. Some found connections. Many found only silence. Part 14, The Aftermath, What History Remembers. After the war, Germany was divided. The East became a communist state under Soviet control. The West was controlled by the Allies, America, Britain, and France. In East Germany, talking about Soviet crimes was forbidden. The Red Army was always called our liberators. Schools didn't mention the rapes or looting. Victims were told to keep quiet or face punishment. In the Soviet Union, it was the same. The Red Army's reputation had to stay clean. The idea that Soviet soldiers committed mass rape and violence didn't fit the official story, so the truth stayed hidden. It was only after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the silence began to break. Historians gained access to old files. Survivors started to speak. Diaries were published. Testimonies were recorded. Now, the truth is better known. But many still don't know how bad it really was. What happened in Germany in 1945 is not just another chapter in a history book. It's not something that can be summed up with a few dates, a few headlines, or a few stats. It's a human story, messy, painful, and still raw after all these years. We often look at World War II and talk about good versus evil. We point to the Nazis and say, they were the bad guys, and we point to the Allies and say, they were the good guys. And in many ways, that's true. Nazi Germany committed some of the worst crimes in history. The Holocaust alone is a scar so deep, it changed the world forever. But real history is rarely that simple. When the war began, it was about power. But when it ended, it became personal. The Red Army didn't just march into Germany to win. They marched in with grief, with hate, with broken hearts, and burned memories. They were sons and fathers, brothers and husbands, many of whom had watched their entire worlds fall apart when Germany invaded their homeland in 1941. And yet, the pain they had suffered didn't make what they did right. The actions of Soviet soldiers, millions of rapes, thousands of murders, countless families destroyed, left behind a legacy of trauma that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. We hear about the destruction of Berlin, about Hitler's bunker, about the surrender. But how often do we hear about the 13-year-old girl who never spoke again after Soviet soldiers found her in a cellar? Or the mother of 3 who was raped in front of her children while begging for mercy? Or the soldiers who couldn't stop it and lived the rest of their lives with guilt and silence? These stories exist, and they deserve to be heard. Because history isn't just about remembering victories. It's about facing the parts we wish weren't true. The parts that make us uncomfortable. The parts that force us to ask hard questions, not just about what happened, but why it happened, and how we let it happen. Some people might say, that's what war is, but it shouldn't be. It's not normal for soldiers to assault civilians. It's not just what happens when a city falls. It's not excusable, just because the other side committed terrible crimes too. If we accept that, Then we accept a world where nothing really matters, where pain is just passed down from one generation to the next, where revenge is confused for justice. And let's be clear, what happened in 1945 wasn't about justice. It was about power. For some Soviet soldiers, it was about finally being on the winning side. For others, it was about punishing people they saw as responsible for their suffering. And for many, it was simply the result of years of rage boiling over with no one to stop it. Does this mean every Soviet soldier was cruel? No, absolutely not. Some protected civilians. Some refused to join in. Some gave food to starving families and helped them survive. But they were not the majority. And the system they were part of, the leadership, the propaganda, the culture of silence, allowed the crimes to continue without consequence. And what about the women who lived through it? Many of them never spoke a word. Some were forced to marry their rapists. Some got pregnant and raised children born of violence, with no support, no counseling, no justice. In many German families, it became a secret passed down in whispers, if at all. Shame, fear, and silence became their inheritance. It wasn't until decades later, long after the Berlin Wall fell, long after the Soviet Union collapsed, that some of these women began to speak. Their voices, though late, changed the way we understand the war. Because until you hear it from them, you don't really understand what 1945 meant. It wasn't just the end of the Third Reich. It was the beginning of another kind of suffering. And here's something else that matters. What the Soviets did in Germany doesn't erase what the Nazis did in the Soviet Union. But what the Nazis did also doesn't excuse what the Soviets did in return. Two wrongs don't make a right. They just make more pain, more victims, more silence. So why does this matter today? Because we still live in a world where war happens, where leaders use hate and fear to divide people, where armies are told who to hate, who to kill, who to punish. And the ones who suffer the most are always the same: the civilians, the families, the ones who didn't get to choose any of it. Understanding what happened in 1945 isn't just about remembering the past. It's about recognizing the signs in the present. It's about holding every side accountable. It's about building a future where we don't keep repeating the same cycles of revenge and violence. And for that to happen, we need to stop sanitizing history. We need to stop telling only the stories that make us feel proud. We need to face the truth, even when it hurts. The Soviet Union played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany. That should never be forgotten. But neither should the crimes that came with that victory. To honor one and ignore the other is to write a line to the history books. And that's why we made this video, to tell the whole story, to give voice to those who were silenced, to remind all of us that war is not just about flags and maps. It's about people, real people, people like you and me. So if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for caring enough to listen. Thank you for being willing to see the world for what it is, not just what we wish it was. And if this made you think, if it opened your eyes a little, if it reminded you that the truth matters, even when it's hard, then subscribe to this channel. Because we're not here to sugarcoat the past. We're here to understand it. And together, we can keep asking the right questions. Thanks for watching. And never forget, the more honestly we face our past, the better chance we have of building a better future.